for, I guess, putting up with sometimes my long-windedness, but as you can see, I'm excited. I like this. I know that we'll probably finish 9, 10-ish. So for those of you who have to leave or have commitments, please do. I won't be offended or anything like that. The next section is about capital planning. This is the stuff that's very much in the news. Probably what we like to focus on and talk about. But there's a lot of considerations that come into it. So hopefully I can give you, again, a crash course into this. So first of all, what the decision-making process is. So there is a lot of high-level planning that occurs. This isn't exactly perfect for Toronto and Ontario, but it gives you a good idea. So when there's a new line, there is government-mandated public consultation process. So there's a few of those happening right now with respect to the Scarborough subway extension and the relief line, which I will talk about shortly. And there'll be other ones coming up this year for Go RER, for Smart Track, and things like that. So the first step is public consultations. It's typically quite widely scoped. Frankly, if you know the people inside, you know they have a pretty good idea of what the shape and location of the line is going to be, but it's important for the public to provide input. There's a lot of new ideas that occur that might be brought up, so they do allow for this part of the process. Once that is done, there's there'll be a kind of a general route, technology chosen, station locations, etc. Well, then, especially with respect to Toronto Council, there's another vote. And this vote is for the funding. Sorry, I should back up. There's a vote before the public consultations can happen. Then there's a vote after the public consultations can happen for them to both accept the findings of the report and the consultations, and then to approve more money to do an environmental assessment. So for transit, in 2008, the Ontario government passed an accelerated framework for transit projects so they can get them done in 6 months. What it assumes is that network planning has been done. It assumes that the best solution is the one on the table and that all alternatives have been considered. So it's 6 months. Normally an EA for a normal piece of infrastructure, especially of this size, you're probably looking at 18 months at the bare minimum to about 36 months. And many of you who are in the consulting world probably have been consulted to do this before. So the 6-month EA, yes, it means that we can get approvals faster, but frankly, since they brought this in 2008, we've only really kicked off one project. I don't even think Eglinton actually used that project. So yes, there's a bit of, like I said, speed up happening there, but did it really change anything? Once the EA is done, that's when we kind of get into a number of different options in terms of how to proceed. The EA has given us an approximate cost. It does take into account some of the underground and underlying conditions of the space. At that point, there may be a vote to send it out to full tender in the case of a design build. So the contractor will design within some specifications and requirements. There might be some change orders because they found more details in design that are more difficult to do, etc. Then they construct it, they hand it back over, and the TTC operates it. In other cases, the city or the TTC or whomever decides to outsource the design as an independent piece. That takes 2 to 3 years, and the vote something comes back. Then you've got to vote again for the construction, and it goes to construction. I will talk about public-private partnerships and alternative procurement and financing models later, but there are other ways where, besides just the design and the construction getting packaged together, they also get the operations and the maintenance and things like that brought in. So we'll touch on that a little bit later, but again, context is important, and it helps you to understand why this takes so long. So the first few things are kind of the ideal world. Like if I was a technocrat and I got full control over everything, what are the things that I would probably think about and prefer when planning the next transit line? So I would probably, this is probably somewhat of a Rishi opinion. I am learning as I go, but from what I gather, this is pretty close to some of the people that I know in the industry. So we focus on a lot of high demand routes and corridors. We would choose the right technology, shape, to match the goals in the ridership. The constructability of a solution is really important, and I will touch on construction very shortly. And I would probably focus on destinations and attractors and connecting those, and I'll explain what that is, instead of residential. So, the big move was after, I guess, the Places to Grow Act in 2006 and the founding of Metrolinx. They developed, I guess developed is a strong word for this, they stitched together the independent rapid transit wish lists and plans of all of the big city GTHA mayors and labeled it the Big Move, and this was released in 2008. And this was kind of the overarching vision for what true rapid transit and regional transit would look like in the region. There's a review of this scheduled to happen, I believe, this year or next year, and so we'll have to see kind of what this came of. They initially tried this from a marketing perspective. They try to talk about this a lot, but if you read Ed Levy's book or you have been in Toronto long enough, you know that this was received with a grain of salt because we've seen grand plans like this before. In terms of the city of Toronto actually does have a long-term transit plan. So these are the corridors they would choose to upgrade, again with infinite money. So the lines in blue are the kind of the current first phase rapid transit projects. Smart Trek isn't on this for now. I will come back to that. And then everything in red is a combination of BRT routes and LRTs and subway lines and extensions and things like that. So there is kind of an overarching plan. Something that is new is that I believe as of 2 or 3 years ago, transit planning and route planning was completely under the TTC's realm. That has now shifted to be under the City of Toronto's realm. So the TTC, I believe, is focusing on operational planning, whereas the City of Toronto is focusing on the corridor planning and linking that with land use, which actually is a really good idea and important, in my opinion. So we talked about, we've seen this chart before in terms of the hierarchy. So you can see in the top right corner, in terms of the subway lines itself, this is the estimated passenger capacity in use at peak based on 30,000 passengers per hour and 6-car trains. I believe this is for 5 to 10 years from now. So we have our hierarchy of what routes need an upgrade. We know where we're at in terms of the various subway lines, those service improvements I previously mentioned notwithstanding. And we know that Yonge and Bloor and the Yonge line is especially problematic. Now, the Yonge line is a big problem because of the station at Finch. You actually have a huge amount of York Region riders who go to Finch Station to get a $3 ride into downtown. It's uncomfortable and it takes an hour, but it's only $3, whereas the Northern GO lines are probably, I don't know the numbers, but let's say $8 to $13 return trip. Sorry, that's probably changed recently, but it's expensive. Let's say $10 to $20 return trip depending on where you are, and it's only a couple times an hour in the morning, a couple times an hour in the evening. That's it. And while it's a little bit faster, it's just not a great service, so that's why service improvements are really important. So again, I like to hammer this point because we talk so much about technology and it's really pointless. You can see here, I mentioned earlier that the Yonge line has a widely different set of speeds that it can operate at based on the station spacing. So the red dots up here is Eglinton to St. George on the Yonge line and St. George to Downsview. So Eglinton to St. George, the subway, which can go up to 100 kilometers an hour, operates at about 20 kilometers an hour on average. Between St. George and Downsview, so the left university side of the line is a bit faster, about 35 to 40, and then Eglinton and Finch is just above 40. Now this has been plotted versus rapid transit speeds relative to stop spacing across Canada. So these are the LRTs in Edmonton and Calgary because there's 3 kilometers between their stations on the outer edges. Right? So LRT can be just as fast as subway if you have stop spacing. If it was a subway, it would still be the same. It'd be the same speed. So it's all depending on stop spacing. So then again, ridership versus technology today, right? So the key is that as technical people, we have a set of tools available to us to solve a problem. We talked earlier about ridership demand, and we can do. There's a lot of assumptions made, but you can do a fairly okay job at forecasting a bit of ridership. But you have to match it to the mode. So again, buses, you get really up to about 1,000, 1,500 per hour, maybe a little bit higher. If you have a dedicated right-of-way or express buses with a lot of service, you can get up to about 3,000. Some of the streetcars kind of show up in the middle here. But up until recently, the next big jump is a heavy rail subway, which really puts you into the 15 to 30,000 riders per hour per direction realm. So LRT sits in this middle ground, not because of the fact that it can't go faster or it couldn't be designed to have more riders, but it's flexible because of its power systems. LRT, because most of the time it's designed with the overhead power, can be underground, it can be at level crossings like trains, or it can be elevated. Subways typically have a third rail, so if your two rails, you have a third rail, which is where the contact and the power comes from. So that's why subways always have to have its dedicated right-of-way and route. Additionally, LRT vehicles themselves actually tend to cost more than subway vehicles because they can cross at grade. Like the arms come down. Like if anybody's ever been to Calgary or Edmonton, it's the same thing as a GO train line when it crosses the street. The arms come down, the LRT passes over, and the arms come up again. Well, for that reason, LRT vehicles are actually side impact reinforced, which subway vehicles are not. Because subway vehicles will never crash into anything, I guess in theory, except another subway car. Whereas an LRT could bump into a lot of things, or more likely, other things could bump into the LRT. So the real key here is the Shepherd subway line. Now, it tends to be the punching bag of the TTC system. Now, to be fair, the line isn't completed to the length that it was initially designed to, or the intention of it. So some of the ridership can be that it's really short, so it doesn't really get you or save you any additional time. It gets you to a mall, not the massive employment node 1.5 kilometers from there. And really it was designed to get you to Scarborough Town Centre and connect to the university line. So it's not fully Shepherd's fault that we didn't construct it. That being said, even if you connected that up, it's still way overbuilt. So the Shepherd line runs today, I guess it's 2015, it opened approximately 2001. I think this year we finally reached the capacity or the demand on the Shepherd line that we said it would be at on the first day of opening. Okay, so planners, we have to make a lot of assumptions to predict ridership. It's really hard to do, but that's an example of one where we didn't really, I guess, to be honest, I don't know this realm that well, but we overbuilt it, and it is what it is today. But the fact is that while the Shepherd line, while the rest of the TTC we pay $3 and we get about an 88-cent subsidy, the Shepherd line actually costs City of Toronto taxpayers $10 to $15 per rider because of the operating costs for that bit. Now that's a huge approximation. You won't find that anywhere, but it's a lot. It's more than $10 for sure. It's been way overbuilt. So when they talk about extending Shepherd, yeah, we might get it up a little bit more, but it's not going anywhere near what it said it would be. Now, one of the other problems with Shepherd is, as you leave or get farther and farther from downtown, the patterns for where people are trying to go also change. The people in Shepherd are actually closer to working in Vaughan and Markham at the 404 and 407 and those big, huge industrial centers there and Consumers Road area than they are to downtown. So building the Shepherd line, this is why we have to be very careful building rapid transit and high-capacity technology in the farther reaches of the city, is because travel patterns are different. We're only going to build this stuff thinking downtown-centrically, but most of the riders aren't going downtown. So this is something we have to think about. So I want to bring in construction really early, which is putting the cart way before the horse, but it's a really important constraint. So first of all, regardless of whether you deep bore, whether it's a subway, so deep bore is a big tunneling machine underground, like they're doing right now for Eglinton and the university line, or you cut and cover, so you literally dig a trench, like they built the Young Line originally, and many of the New York subway lines. You still have to rip up roads. So who drives Eglinton on a regular basis? Okay, so not that many of you. So right now they have a deep bore tunneling machine, and then in a few different spots, as the machine comes up, they have like 50 feet or 100 feet of like a construction zone, then about 100, 200 meters, then another construction zone. There's these weird sporadic gaps. But what they're building is a station head wall. So they're pouring essentially the wall that the two ends of the station. Just wait until, I think it's next year, when they start building the stations. Because you can't build stations by boring. You're going to take out that entire 250, 300 meter stretch all the way along Eglinton for the next 4 years. So subways don't rip up roads, right? The other thing that's really important is utility relocation and upgrades. So while you're underground and ripping these things up, it's not a bad idea to actually do these upgrades while we're down there anyways. Now that does mean the costs increase, and that we always get presented with one fat number that this project is X dollars over budget, but it's because the scope is changing a lot of the time too. The other thing is geographic features. So a lot of these vehicles can't do a lot of different inclines. So there's a lot of interesting ideas on how we deal with the Don Valley, for example. Some people say, well, why don't we go all the way down and all the way up? And it would take you 5 or 10 kilometers to get all the way down and then all the way back up again. So anyway, some ideas there. Again, curves. The TDC has preferred radius for their curves that they at least try to adhere to, right? So that it's the smaller the curve, the more wear and tear, and they have to run the train slower. So again, that impacts service. The other thing that I recently learned about at these relief line events is the preference to tunnel under rights of way. So that's the preference to tunnel under land that the city owns or existing roads. Now the reason for that is they actually have to pay. In Ontario, we have infinite rights all the way into the ground, into the core of the earth, which is different to out west where you only have surface rights. So in Ontario, every house you tunnel under has to get paid out a little bit. It's not a huge amount of money, but you do get paid out. Additionally to that, you have to have things like emergency exits and ventilation shafts, etc. So in order to build this, you do need it. That's why they prefer to do it. The other thing is the different methods have different costs. People always ask, why is subway construction so expensive in Toronto? Well, because we don't want to interfere with traffic as much as possible, and frankly, I wouldn't want my neighborhood probably ripped up for 5 years either, or even 3 years, we don't do trenching and cut and cover. But that would be about 1/3 of the cost of tunneling. Now, it'd be a lot more of an eyesore for probably a little bit longer of a time, but you could do it a lot cheaper. So again, it's the environment that we operate in. In general, these are some of the ranges that people use. Very, very kind of approximate. It does not take into account kind of fixed costs and overheads. But subways tend to run from $300 million to $1 billion per kilometer. LRTs, again, get in that similar range, but because you can run them at surface, you can get some runs of it that are cheaper. You have streetcar, BRT, etc. The key is that each individual station runs about $150 to $300 million. So adding a new station is a big deal. Additionally, when you have to have bridges or special waterproof tunnels to go under the lake, to go under the rivers, etc., again, that run is fairly expensive. What's really cool is on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the $1 billion per kilometer, which is approximately what New York is paying for their 2nd Avenue subway. Now that's for 2 reasons. One, it's under a ton of high-rises, so you have to go both deeper but also reinforce it more. And second to that, it's on the ocean, so you have to waterline the entire length of the subway. So I talked about transit destinations. So in the planning world, predicting where people live what the ridership is going to be based on where people live is really hard. But predicting ridership based on where they want to go is really easy, relatively easy. So these are all the major employment districts outside of downtown. And the black overlay is where the 4 or 5 projects that are the most current and most likely to move forward, again, not counting Smart Track for now, are likely to go. So you have the Toronto-York subway extension to Vaughan, which crosses York University. You have the Crosstown line, the Eglinton line, whatever they decide to do on Shepherd East, and the Scarborough subway extension, which is likely to go somewhere in this kind of quarter. Similarly, you can kind of get a distribution for employment across the city. It's kind of redundant, so I think I'll just move along. The last thing is higher education. I am a full-time student at the moment, so I understand the need to be able to get around quickly, easily, and cheaply. We do a really poor job at connecting our higher education institutes to rapid transit. Out of all of these, Ryerson and U of T are basically on the subway line. George Brown's a little bit farther off. This one's on it. Sorry, Seneca, no chance Humber. Sorry, this Seneca, none of this either. So, in these cases, you have 30, 40, 50,000 students and beyond who have to get to campus. So, again, connecting transit to employment and higher education institutions is a really good guarantor for getting riders. So, reevaluating next phases. So, finally got a picture with Smart Track on it. So you have the existing system. There's the big U that we all know and love. You have the York subway extension, the Finch West LRT. You have the GO train lines on here, which is making this complicated. You have the existing alignment for Smart Track, which is really just Go RER with a fancy name and branding with a little spur off of it. But there's the big problem at Yonge and Bloor. And then there's what they're studying for the relief line, which really the idea would be to not go through Union because there's huge capacity problems there, but somewhere in this kind of lower part of downtown, up, and the idea would be to connect kind of up through this corridor, essentially. So with what I showed you in mind, I mean, Smart Tracks, in terms of connecting to an employment, it's a really good idea, but it really helps the suburbs more than it helps Toronto. Right? Because it connects people up here into the Markham working area, and it connects people over here to the Airport Corporate Center, which the Airport Corporate Center is the second largest employer outside of downtown in the GTA. So that's why it's a good idea. This part is really difficult to construct, and I would put money on it that it doesn't end up happening. The Eglinton line has a plan to extend to the airport and through here, so the second phase is probably more likely to go through here than the Smart Track is to make this dogleg, which is basically impossible. We have Shepherd East that goes through some of these employment areas and the Scarborough subway, etc. So the existing plans do a decent job with kind of stitching the city together. Yes.
Okay.
No problem.
I was actually just curious. There seems to be a move towards working from home now. How does that actually impact? We talked about policy a bit, but not so much.
I think it's tough. I honestly don't have really an opinion on that. I think even if it goes from a fraction of a percent to 1%, like that's probably a huge shift. Even to, you know what I mean? So I don't know if that's really a realistic long-term solution, but things change really quickly with technology, right? So I don't really have a good take on that. So overall, we do a pretty good idea. I think the one red flag and hugely controversial one is what's been done with the Scarborough subway, which I'll touch on later. There is some arguments to be made for one side versus the other, but I'll come to that later. So what else should we consider? So do we want to consider growth today and economics? Do we want to look at planning for tomorrow? We can look at residential because we tend to talk a lot about that, but I'll show you a little bit of data that talks a little bit about this in Toronto.
Sorry, I was just wondering if I missed it, the connection Union to the airport by Metrolinx, that's coming up in the next
Yes.
months, I believe?
Yes, so I'm going to do an update on all the existing projects shortly. That is coming, but that's not really rapid transit, so it's a provincial project, so I'm not focusing on that a ton. So the key is the resurgence of downtown Toronto. So first of all, it's 3% of the city's land area, 1/3 of the job base, 1/4 of the tax base, and 50% of Toronto's GDP. It's 5 to 6% of Canada's GDP by itself. Right? So there's residential and commercial development happening right now. Then the one thing to say about demographics is that yes, there is something to be said for a lot of the condos that are going up. I will say that the largest cohort in the GTA area is the 15 to 30 or so cohort, and by age, which is very similar to the baby boomer cohort in terms of size. So we're going to be okay, I think, for 5 or 10 years. It's beyond that I would worry a little bit about the condo market, in my opinion. The second thing that I will say about that is Toronto's rental market is still extremely low vacancy. So while Vancouver's property prices are way higher than ours, their vacancy rate is closer to 7%, which is a little bit above the healthy number of 5 that you want to aim for. Toronto's vacancy rate is 2% and below. So rental prices are through the roof right now, and what you're actually seeing, which is kind of neat, is that a lot of developers are recognizing this, and there have been 2 condos in the last month that have basically torn up the previous contracts for people to buy it, and they're converting to purpose-built rental units. So there's some new things kind of happening in this space that we'll address soon. So it's something to be said. It's not so doom and gloom yet, but anyways. In the top right, there's kind of there was a report done by Emerson Consulting with Deloitte about the growth in office space that's going to occur over the next 20 to 30 years, and Toronto, York, and Peel take up the vast majority of that. So I think this is kind of cool. This is the Toronto skyline in the year 2000 versus the year 2014. And somebody did this on urban Toronto. So this is absolutely mind-boggling. I mean, I grew up in the area. I left about 10 years ago to go to school and live away for a bit, and so I remember when City Place was the driving range. I remember that well. The Jameson exit has always been terrible for anybody who's lived in the Toronto area for a long time, but that amount of growth is astounding, and yet there's such a push and pull in the city about better serving downtown, whereas it's such a hugely important part of the area. So then, in terms of development applications, so this is about 1 year old, the 2013 development applications and where they kind of show up across the city. So we're doing pretty well, I guess, across the city in general. There is quite a bit of development. Downtown, obviously, is doing very, very well, but so is North York. And then lastly, again, outside of downtown only, is this idea of what the planning department's calling the Avenues Plan. So what they're going to do, and they've basically, I believe it's passed now, is that they've zoned up all the major east-west avenues in the entire city to mid-rise. So you can have, as long as you have buildings that are basically no taller than the width of the road and the sidewalks itself, they will allow that development to occur. So that's a good use of distributing a little bit of the load outside of downtown, but that's an important part of it, and that will allow for, again, a little bit more uniform usage and a little bit of less of downtown centricity. I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip the next slide, but what it was just about future downtown travel demand, and this is projected to 2031, and kind of thinking about where all the people come from. So it's not critical at the moment. All right, so the key here, I mentioned earlier that I don't really care as much about residential sources. The reason is 2 things. First of all, in terms of density, everybody says that you can't have transit here because no density or whatever that is. The actual walk-in catchment area that we use is 400 meters. There's nowhere in the city of Toronto that has enough density to meet a subway's requirements. So it's not about walk-in catchment area and walk-in traffic for a subway. It's about the feeder routes. So, as I mentioned earlier, only 4 TTC buses don't touch the subway, so the feeder system is not going to change. I think it's really neat to see what's going to happen on Eglinton in about 5 years, because you now have that, what used to be the Bloor-Danforth line as the break point.
Sorry to cut you off,
Yeah.
and this is not necessarily a fair comment, I expect to answer, but I made some notes. I'm curious about, you look at convert auto-dependent suburbs. technology change coming out, not just cycling, climate change, self-driving cars, self-parking vehicles, electric vehicles, Uber, car sharing, there's a whole lot of stuff going on. Are we giving enough consideration to the planning and how that might impact what's going to happen in 5, 10, 15 years?
So
Do you think there's enough consideration going on that kind of change?
So at the end of the day, it's still a car, and there's still fixed space. And for my traffic operations studies, I'll tell you that a city street can pass 1,700 cars per hour on any point. Most cars have 1 to 1.5 people in them, right? A highway is about 2,400. That same point on any rapid transit mode, you're talking the tens of thousands. So you can have all this technology. We might have less auto ownership, absolutely. But we still have the same capacity, the same need to move. So at the end of the day, because of induced demand, the roads are not going to be any less clogged. So this is more about movement efficiency with existing space, is kind of what I'm getting at. So I don't really see, I read a good article about that. I think there was a good discussion on Steve Monroe's blog this week actually about that, for those of you who know him. I don't really see it as the big panacea that everybody else does, but I don't know. I think people have said that before, right, about technology, so. So, again, I'm going to try to speed up a little bit because I do like to talk. This is a spread of the population density across Toronto from 2011. So, again, it's very downtown centric, but we do okay in some other areas outside downtown as well in terms of medium density. What I think is really cool is the auto-oriented suburbs. So, has anybody heard of a website called walkscore.com? Yeah. Okay, so you can basically put in your postal code, and it'll give you an approximate score based on what services and cycling and transit facilities are close to you. So somebody I know who's a big GIS expert did this for Toronto, but it really does show that it's, like I said before, the way that land use is done, in the farther you get away from downtown, you're forced to use a car. And not only that, you have poor transit service. So there is, like, social equity is a really big part of the Toronto discussion because we are so far behind. And so this is just a really cool kind of progression that the farther out you go, they're more car-centric and they're forced to be car-centric. And they also don't have the same amount of zoning and land use, so you can't really even do things close to you. Anybody who's kind of on the inside, you can do a lot of walking, which both from a convenience and a public health perspective is really important. Again, this puts Smart Track and the 4 or 5 lines I've mentioned onto a graph, and it basically shows how the majority of people get to work along those lines. So the blue or the purple, I don't know, that color is people who use car. The green is the people who tend to take transit, and the red is people who are walking. So we're not building transit to the core to help downtowners. Out of the people who live downtown, 40% of them walk to work, 10% or so bike to work, 25% of them take transit, and 25% drive. So it's not for downtowners, it's to get people to downtown because that's where the opportunities and the jobs are. The last thing is this really neat study that is being done at U of T about this idea of the 3 Torontos. So this kind of shows you kind of a change in terms of the census, in terms of how incomes have changed over the last 35 to 40 years or so. And it really does show an interesting trend where the inner city is gentrifying quickly, and a lot of, frankly, professionals and wealth is moving into the inner city, and that is also forcing people to the suburbs, to the outside, right? So it's a really interesting dichotomy that we have, and it's an interesting problem we have in Toronto because in the U.S. you have a tight core, but a poor set of inner suburbs and a rich outer suburb, and we have the reverse in Toronto within the city limits. Now, yes, Mississauga and Vaughan, etc., they obviously tend to have higher income people, but it's just, again, it's interesting within the city limits. I'm just going to skip this, but the idea is that there are priority neighborhoods in the city that we identify and update on a yearly basis in terms of those who maybe need more services, maybe economically a disadvantage and things like that. And I've overlaid somewhat crudely where the new lines will be. Now, one thing that I think is interesting is that The SRT currently goes through Dorset Park, and the new Scarborough subway will miss it entirely. This is a medium density area, this is a low density area. Now there is development potential there, and whatever, but in terms of the justification that was used to talk about that line, it's a little bit murky. The other thing is that the Scarborough LRT upgrade was meant to go from here to Centennial College and connect to Malvern. It's going to do neither of those things under the subway plan. So there is something to be said for connecting Scarborough Centre, which is the only remaining centre in Toronto that wouldn't be directly on the subway, to the main trunk lines. I will accept that as a reasonable argument. But don't tell me that it's better for equity, it's better for development. Don't tell me it's better for all these different things, because it's really not. If you want to connect it to the subway, fine, say that. But there's a lot of murkiness around this. That's why there's so much polarization. The last thing is in terms of density of TTC stops. This is kind of a somewhat pointless map, but interesting. I thought it was kind of cool with the colors work out, but it's pretty uniform across the city. I mean, downtown obviously has a lot, but I thought it was cool to look at. All right, home stretch, I promise. Okay, funding. Everything in Toronto.
What was the route for the Scarborough subway line decided? Was it during Rockfort's maintenance?
So there was some back and forth, and right now it's under public consultation. So they haven't defined on a route yet, but it's essentially a done deal. And it's one thing I will say is that it seems like there's an appetite now to stop reopening previous decisions, which actually is one of the biggest problems. Like, some bad decisions will always get made, but let's move on, right? And that was one of the biggest problems in the last few years. Funding is, again, we need tri-level partnerships to do this. City and city residents, for all the tax that we end up paying and the wealth that we generate here, we get 5 to 6 cents of that back per tax dollar spent in terms of transfers and things like that. So I think there's going to be a fundamental shift because of how powerful all of the cities in Canada are becoming, and frankly around the world, with how this is done. But this gives you an idea in terms of 4 dramatically different transit systems with multiple different technologies and how they were funded. So there is national and state level and city level and private sector kind of shared funding that occurs. So that's one of the biggest problems that we're running into. And as cheap as I said our property taxes are, it really wasn't designed to pay for infrastructure like this. So financing and project management. P3s are not a funding mechanism. It's a financing mechanism. It's the same idea as going to get a mortgage. If you don't have any income, you're not getting a mortgage. Same thing. P3s are a way to construct things and to finance the project, right? So that's important to know. There's a lot of different ways this can happen. It's not privatizing necessarily. It's also not doing everything contracted out locally with an in-house team. With how much subway rapid transit construction starts and stops, it's really difficult to maintain a very competent, multi-skilled team in-house to do this. So in my opinion, for the contractors and the consultants in the room, you guys are the key to this. Like, there has to be kind of a symbiotic relationship where we work together. And so this tends to be a very, very controversial topic. I think that the far ends of the spectrum, as always, are in hysterics a little bit, and we have to start compromising a little bit and finding a good middle ground, and there are some good options. So that is the final things on transit planning and kind of how we draw lines on a map and things to consider. I'm just going to do a really quick rundown on where we're at in terms of the major projects under construction and about to be built today. There's a Toronto-York subway, Spadina, thank you, Spadina subway extension. We just had some major announcements about some major overruns and delays. I honestly don't have the expertise, really don't have the expertise to comment on this, and it's really new, so I'm going to leave it as is. There have been some cost inflations for a lot of different reasons, and while the tunnel boring is complete, the stations are not, and there is no way to partially open this line, So it's been delayed a little bit more again, and I believe the latest update was probably 2018 or 2019 now when this will open. So presented without comment.
Blackford said that they presented to the council 2017, the cost over around $9 million.
I thought that 2017 was before Friday's announcement, but like I said, this is all brand new, so I'm a little bit off.
On the radio.
Okay. Though this morning.
I heard him say that he was going to push it. 2019 was unacceptable.
Okay.
And 2017 is what he's pushing for, but that would be another group that he's bringing in to take over the Lennon.
Sure.
One of his buddies from the
Okay. Well, thank you. Like I said, some decisions are in progress on this. So we'll see kind of what happens in the next couple of days, in the next few weeks. So what remains of the Transit City LRTs. So these are the three lines that we've had studies done for a few years now, and that keep getting pushed away. So first of all, which I cannot emphasize enough, LRTs are not streetcars, and they run in their own tracks. Their own rights of way. They will not interfere with cars. Cars will not interfere with them. The other thing I will say is that on Shepherd and on Finch, there is enough room to maintain all of the existing traffic lanes for basically the entire length, I think 90% plus of the length of it. So again, there's a lot of misinformation about this. But what I will add is by shifting to an LRT in the middle of the road, you've now taken the dozens of buses that sit in that right lane every single hour, all day, every day, off the roads. So you're actually increasing the capacity of the road for vehicles by doing this plan, and it's very cost effective. So again, that's the 3D mock-up of it. There's still 3 lanes both directions. Finch and Shepherd. So there'll be a big vote at the executive committee meeting, which is either this week or next week. And there was some talk about should we revisit the plans for Finch and Shepherd again. For the same amount of dollars, a friend of mine put up this, or created these comparators between what can be built for X billion dollars under both technologies, as well as the travel time. So today, it's 43 and 54 minutes by bus and then subway to get to the university and the Young Lines. With the subway, yes, you'll save a couple of extra minutes because you go a little bit farther underground, but you're still on the bus. With the LRT, you get both travel time savings and cost savings to do this. They are the right plans for the area. Finch, frankly, if you look at the numbers, Finch shouldn't even be an LRT, but frankly, in the interest of social equity and to build up that area and that region a little bit, that's why it's going to be boosted to an LRT. Shepherd East does meet the LRT numbers and comes nowhere close to a subway number. So it's the right idea. You can see in the case of Shepherd, there's going to be about, I believe it's 20 or so stops, approximately. The Finch line is a bit shorter, but this gets you quite a bit all along there, and this will spur a lot of development. So where are we at today in terms of Smart Track and the Relief Line and the Scarborough Subway Extension? So for those of you who follow this file, you know that those are 3 major projects all on the east side of the city. For once, they are considering the network impact and setting them all somewhat simultaneously and together. So there's studies happening right now about Smart Track, the Relief Line, which will come through this corridor, and then whatever will happen with the Scarborough Subway. So that is happening simultaneously. If you are at all interested in going to public consultations, the first Relief Line one happened already a few weeks ago. There'll be another 3 sets of them this year. Smart Track will have 2 or 3 starting in the spring and the summer, and Scarborough just had theirs, I think, in February or January, and they'll have a couple more. So this gives you a chance to, again, understand a little bit more details of a specific project, but also give your own input with local context.
Where do you hear about this?
The City of Toronto, there's a reliefline.ca, there's feelingcongested.com are the 2 major ones, and honestly I don't remember the Scarborough one, but the City of Toronto is doing a really good job of public consultation, things like that, and They're going to start to also do this informally in subway stations and a few other places, at malls and all that, so that people who don't typically follow this file, like me who goes to a lot of these events, are also given a chance to provide input. So the Scarborough subway extension, this is Scarborough by itself, kind of separated from the city. The dotted line is where the SRT was going to be removed and where the LRT would be. This is the corridor that they are studying for a route. The initial desire was to go right and then up McCowan. At Kennedy, the tracks are east-west anyways. That's the easiest thing to do. Because Smart Track is going to come along here and actually straight up here now, there's some talk that they want to push the extension farther east, but that costs extra money, and so there's a lot of uncertainty about that. So we'll have to just kind of see where that happens, but that's kind of where we're at with Scarborough. What's a really kind of cool area, and I'm going to talk for 2 seconds about freeways, is what they're going to do in the Gardner East. So this is the Lever Brothers site, and you can see how just, this is about Sherburne, I think. The Gardner kind of pitches around and goes up here. In the next, I think, 2 or 3 months, or reports due in May, they have to decide what to do because the Gardner has to be rehabilitated. Now the most likely plan is that they're actually going to, sorry, I should back up 1 step. This site is critical to Smart Track's funding plan, which is tax increment financing, which is basically extracting some of the additional property value that will occur by developing this site. So with the Gardner the way it is, you block off this entire realm for development. This site is useless because of where the elevated deck comes over here. So what is most likely to happen is either they'll tear down the section of the Gardner, which is built way over capacity and is not used very much, and make it a very wide boulevard, or they're going to cut the corner, which is a really difficult feat engineering-wise, so I'm sure some of you could tell me how hard that's going to be, and that'll open up development here and here. And so there's a ton of things that are about to happen east of downtown that will all be decided in the next 6 months or so that are really key to all of this. The Don Mouth revitalization and floodplain development, which is here-ish, is really critical to opening up the portlands too. So if anybody's familiar with Canary Wharf in London, that's what they're trying to do here. So they're talking about zoning it to develop 12 to 15 million square feet of office, connecting Smart Track to a stop there, maybe a GO station, and possibly the Relief Line to have a station there too, in addition to direct access to the Gardner. So this is a huge ton of development that will happen there, and it's basically critical to most of these lines being funded. There's a question earlier about Up Express. It's about to open. It's a 4-stop premium express route from Terminal 1 to Union. There was obviously a lot of hoopla about fares and why it's so expensive. One thing that I didn't mention at all is that in planning, we give value of time to travel. We approximately do it, I think the number right now is about $13.82 per hour is how much we value your time at when you're traveling. So one of the planners in the city did a comparison between the premium services in a couple cities around the world and the time versus the cost, as well as what that is in Toronto. So the key is that a taxi to downtown is variable travel time because of traffic. 25 to maybe an hour, it's $50. The TTC, which will take you an hour plus, is about $3, whereas the Up Express with a Presto discount for 25 minutes is $19. So we'll have to see kind of what happens. I personally think their pricing's a little bit aggressive, but again, we can't just look at the number by itself without thinking about the travel time premium that occurs with that. So we'll have to see.
Is there a bus going from Kipling to the airport?
Correct. That's the 192, and that's $3, but it takes about an hour and 10 minutes to get to Union from there.
It's an example, in my mind, of ineptness on Metrolinx part of the pricing because it's $29 without Presto, it's $19 with Presto, and with 19 hours service, 50 minutes a day, it's going to result in 35% capacity utilization, which means 65% of the trains are going to be empty. So if they keep, and this is all because of fare by distance, if they come up with a $10, flat fare, get trial, you'd have 1.8 million more passengers, more revenue
Sure.
So why do you build $450 million in infrastructure to have it run 65%, price it to run 65%? It's nuts.
So what I will say is that in terms of my conversations with people there, somewhat internally, what their idea is that they in their mind, they want to, it's kind of an experiment with the value of time premium. I don't think they believe that this number will stay constant. They'll probably try it for a year or so and see where they're at. I think they want to, they're playing an economics game to kind of see where that balance is. And there's something to be said for that experiment. I kind of like that, but I don't know.
But you know, it's like building Shepherd and running it at 4,500 passengers an hour.
Yeah.
And that's what they're doing with Union Person Express. Why spend $400 million and run it and price it to run at 35% capacity? It's nuts.
Especially with UberX making those cab costs a lot cheaper.
Yeah.
And Google Maps doing dynamic arbitrage for the
Wow, I talk a lot. I need to finish this up in like 5 minutes.
It seems that we're going into questions and answers.
Very
Before
short.
we proceed further,
Yes.
I would like to present you with a token of appreciation
Thank you.
from the chapter. No, because some people start leaving, so I want to do that before.
No, that's
yeah.
okay. Thank you for
So
having me.
this has been a very interesting and insightful presentation. Thank you very much. This is a mechanical pencil and a pen with the PEO logo on it.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate
You're very
that.
welcome.
All right, I'm going to show quickly, Waterloo and Ottawa's LRTs are under construction. They'll be open within the next 3 or 4 years. Hamilton and Peel is a little bit up in the air. This is kind of a neat map that somebody did, which is based on the ridership in Mississauga and where the most demand is. So it seems pretty obvious that this is here Ontario and this is Dundas. So here Ontario, it's pretty justified to get an LRT. They already have a lot of express buses in service along there. The problem is the Brampton end of it because they don't really want to pay for it. For Dundas, there's a BRT in the long-term plan, so this kind of lines up. Hamilton is, I guess, experiencing a little bit of Toronto syndrome where they can't make up their mind and for what they want, so we'll have to see kind of what happens next. I talked about a bunch of these already, so I'll skip them. Transit building myths, we talk about a 2-tier system. In my opinion, it should be a 6-tier system. It should be based on abundant access and frequent access and reliable access, because you wouldn't build the biggest high school in the province in the middle of Barrie, for example, right? Like, you have to build based on what is there and what you can reasonably project. So that's kind of a big thing. Projecting is very difficult, so the build it and they will come attitude is really a 50-year plan, not 10 years, right? So Shepherd is finally seeing intensification 15 years later. It takes longer than everybody thinks. And I will leave them there for a second. Just in terms of where I get my info from, there's lots of events, and if you just take my card, I can always, I guess I can present you this list later. I do want to credit the pile of blogs that I read, including Steve Monroe's, which is a mecca for anybody who likes to know the nittiest of grittiest of details of all of this. And I do follow a lot on Twitter, which is what keeps me kind of current with everything. And final thoughts is that we really do need an updated governance and decision-making structure, because it's broken right now. It's very win-lose. We need to stop redoing study after study on the same corridor. Start building projects, ideally, and dedicated funding might help address some of these issues. So I'm sorry that I spoke so long. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If there are any questions, I'm happy to hang out for a little bit, and I'll just leave this on the back there. Thank you.